For more than a decade, one face on Pawn Stars didn't fit the usual mold of the show. While Rick, Corey, Chumlee, and the old man haggled over guns, coins, and motorcycles, a quiet, precise woman would occasionally walk through the door of the world-famous gold and silver pawn shop carrying something far older than anything else on the counter. A first edition, a signed manuscript, a fragile piece of paper worth more than most cars. Her name is Rebecca Romney, and for years she was the only consistent female expert the show ever had. Fans nicknamed her the Book Lady. She built a reputation for being calm under pressure, impossible to fluster, and terrifyingly good at spotting fake. But behind that composed television persona is a far stranger, far more interesting story than anything that ever aired in a 10-minute segment. One that starts in Idaho, runs through a pawn shop in Las Vegas, and ends up rewriting how we think about forgotten women writers of the 18th century. Rebecca Romney was born in 1985 in Idaho. She has said in her own words that she grew up as just a girl from Idaho with a fairly undistinguished academic career, and there's something genuinely disarming about hearing one of the most respected rare book experts in America describe herself that way. She didn't come from money, and she didn't come from a family of booksellers. There was no inherited shop, no mentor pulling strings, no rare book dynasty waiting for her. Whatever she built from nothing. She went on to study linguistics and classical studies at Brigham Young University. It's an unusual academic combination for someone who would later spend her career authenticating centuries-old texts, but it turned out to be exactly the right foundation. Understanding how language changes over time, how syntax and spelling shift across centuries, how a scribe's handwriting evolves. These are the exact tools you need to tell a genuine 17th century document from a clever fake. Nobody sets out to become a professional forgery spotter through a philosophy degree. But in Romney's case, that strange, specific mix of classical language training turned out to be the perfect, if accidental, apprenticeship for the career waiting on the other side of graduation. After finishing her studies, Romney did something that, by her own account, made very little sense on paper. She applied for a position at Bauman Rare Books, one of the largest and most respected antiquarian book dealers in the United States. She had no professional experience in the rare book trade. None. She wasn't a lifelong collector. She hadn't apprenticed under a bookseller, and she didn't have a network of contacts in the antiquarian world. By most conventional hiring standards, she should not have gotten the job. But Bauman Rare Books was opening a new gallery in Las Vegas in 2007, and they were looking for someone sharp, quick, and capable of learning fast. Romney's academic background in languages and classical texts caught their attention in a way that a typical resume in the field wouldn't have. They hired her. It's one of those small, almost accidental decisions that quietly redirects an entire life. She has said herself that this one opportunity changed the course of her life, and it's hard to argue otherwise. Within a few years, she would be handling material that most people only ever see behind museum glass. The rare book trade is not a business where you learn from a textbook. It's a business built on close, careful, hands-on study of paper fibers, of ink chemistry, of binding techniques, of the tiny irregularities that separate an authentic 17th century printing from a later reproduction. Romney spent her early years at Bauman absorbing all of it, working her way up from someone with zero trade experience to someone trusted with genuinely extraordinary material. Leaves from the Gutenberg Bible, Shakespeare folios, first editions of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, and other objects where a single misjudgment could cost a client or the gallery a fortune. By 2010, just 3 years after walking in with no relevant experience at all, she had become manager of the Las Vegas Gallery. That's a remarkably fast rise in a field that traditionally rewards decades of quiet apprenticeship over speed. It says something about both her natural aptitude and the sheer number of hours she put into learning a trade that most people spend a lifetime mastering. Las Vegas is a smaller world than its skyline suggests, especially once you get into specialized trades like antiques and rare documents. Rick Harrison had been running the family pawn shop since long before cameras ever showed up, and when unusual paper items came through the door, old letters, historical documents, antique books, he needed someone who actually understood what they were looking at, not just someone who could look up a price online. Bauman Rare Books had opened its Las Vegas location. The same General Era Harrison shop was becoming a television phenomenon, and the two businesses existed in overlapping professional circles. When Pawn Stars needed a rare book specialist, they didn't need to run an open casting call. There was already a known, respected expert working a few miles away. Romney made her first appearance on the show in Season 4 in 2011, and from that point on she became the person the shop called whenever paper, ink, or old bindings walked through the door. What made Romney stand out on Pawn Stars wasn't showmanship. If anything, it was the total absence of it. Where other experts on reality television tend to lean into drama, the gasp, the dramatic pause, the raised eyebrow, Romney's style was almost clinical. She would examine paper texture, check the consistency of the ink, study the way a signature had been formed, and deliver a verdict in the same, even tone, whether the item in front of her was worth $400 or $40,000. That calm, matter-of-fact delivery became her signature. Fans loved it precisely because it felt like the real thing, an actual expert working through an actual process, not a performance built for the camera. Over the years she appeared on the show, Romney evaluated an extraordinary range of material. She examined Civil War-era paper and Confederate financial documents. She authenticated a first edition of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, one of only 250 copies printed in its first run in 1859. A book whose impact on science and religion is almost impossible to overstate. She looked at Shakespeare folios, weighing the difference between a genuine 17th century printing and a later, far less valuable imitation. She examined signed items, presidential documents, and centuries-old manuscripts, all while running a full-time career in the rare book trade completely separate from the show. According to her own account of her television career, Romney appeared in more than 50 episodes of Pawn Stars between 2011 and the mid-2020s, spanning both the original series and the spin-off Pawn Stars Do America. That's a far longer and more consistent run than casual viewers might assume, especially since her appearances became less frequent in later years, for reasons that have nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with simple geography. It's also worth pointing out what her presence meant structurally to the show itself. For most of its run, Pawn Stars has been a heavily male ensemble. Rick, his father, Corey, Chumlee, bartering over guns, cars, and collectibles in a shop that, at least visually, projects a very masculine kind of Americana. Romney was, for years, the only consistent female expert to appear regularly on the program, and she occupied that role in a category, old paper and rare books, where her specific expertise simply wasn't something anyone else in the cast could match. That combination made her stand out in the ensemble in a way that had nothing to do with novelty and everything to do with genuine specialization. Here's where the real story diverges sharply from a lot of the rumors that have circulated online. Over the years, certain corners of the internet have spun elaborate stories about Romney's reduced presence on the show, federal investigations, stolen artifacts, secretive exits, mysterious silences. It makes for a dramatic narrative. It is also not what actually happened. The far less sensational, far more verifiable truth is this. Romney's on-camera appearances slowed down because she moved. She had been working out of Bauman's Las Vegas gallery, which is what made her so easy for the shop to call on in the first place. But her career took her to Philadelphia, where she took on a larger role managing the firm's central operations, overseeing library acquisitions and catalog production for Bauman Rare Books on the East Coast. Once she was thousands of miles from the gold and silver pawn shop, being available for spontaneous filming became logistically difficult, not professionally impossible. She didn't vanish. She didn't get pulled off the show by any agency. She simply built a career that took her somewhere else, and a reality show built around a specific physical pawn shop in Las Vegas naturally saw less of her as a result. She never fully left the Pawn Stars world either. Even after relocating, she continued to make occasional appearances, and in 2022 she rejoined the crew for an episode of Pawn Stars Do America filmed in Washington, D.C., appraising a rare pirate-related book and picking right back up with the easy chemistry she'd always had with Chumlee and Corey. That's not the behavior of someone hiding from a scandal. It's the behavior of someone who simply built a full life and full career outside the frame of a single television show. After her time managing operations in Philadelphia, Romney's career kept moving. She spent several years, roughly from 2016 to 2019, working at Honey and Wax booksellers in Brooklyn. This wasn't a step down or a quiet retreat. It was where some of her most interesting and original work took shape. Alongside fellow bookseller Heather O'Donnell, Romney co-founded the Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize, an annual award that recognizes the most original and personally meaningful book collections assembled by women 30 years old or younger. This prize wasn't about market value. It wasn't about who owned the most expensive first edition. It was about rewarding people for building collections that meant something, for finding a theme, a passion, or a story and chasing it through the secondhand book world regardless of price tags. Romney has spoken about noticing a pattern in the collecting world. Plenty of women were passionate, careful, and knowledgeable collectors, but far fewer were confident calling themselves collectors out loud, a label that had long carried a certain old boys club connotation. The prize was, in a quiet way, a corrective to that, a public platform that said explicitly that this kind of passion counted and deserved recognition. In 2019, Romney took the biggest professional leap of her career. After more than a decade working for other people's firms, Baum & Rare Books, then Honey and Wax, she co-founded her own rare book company, Type Punch Matrix, alongside bookseller Brian Cassidy. The firm is based in Washington, D.C., and deals in what its founders describe as pivotal works across a wide range of fields: literary first editions, historically significant manuscripts, scientific texts, and material that doesn't always fit the traditional mold of what valuable old book is supposed to mean. Leaving a stable, salaried position in a notoriously difficult industry is not a small risk, and Romney has been candid about exactly how carefully she had to plan it. As a parent supporting 2 children, she has said she could not afford to walk away from a paycheck until she was certain the new venture could sustain her family from day one. Bookselling, especially the kind built around rare and unusual material, is not an industry known for quick, reliable income. Building Type Punch Matrix into something that could genuinely support her required exactly the same patience and precision she'd spent over a decade developing while authenticating other people's treasures. Type Punch Matrix has since built a reputation for taking rare book collecting somewhat outside its traditional lanes, mixing beloved literary classics with less obvious, more unconventional texts, and treating collecting as something that should be expanding, not staying locked into the same narrow set of important authors it has revolved around for generations. Somewhere along the way, without ever quite intending to, Romney became something more than a working bookseller. Between her long run on Pawn Stars and a growing presence on Instagram, TikTok, and other platforms, she built an audience of several 100,000 followers interested in rare books, literary history, and the strange, often overlooked stories behind old texts. By her own admission, this part of the job doesn't come naturally to her. She has described herself as temperamentally not suited to social media, and has talked openly about needing to step back periodically to cycle out the toxicity that comes with a large online following before she can return to posting comfortably. It's a candid admission from someone whose television persona was always so composed, and it adds a layer of honesty to her public story that a lot of reality TV figures never bother offering. She keeps doing it anyway, not because she loves the platform, but because she's found that showing people the human stories behind old books is one of the most effective ways to pull new people into a trade that can otherwise feel closed off and intimidating. In 2017, Romney co-wrote her first book, Printer's Error: Irreverent Stories from Book History, together with her then-husband, author J.P. Romney. It's a collection of strange, entertaining, and often forgotten stories from the history of printing and publishing, the kinds of anecdotes that rarely make it into standard literary history, from forged editions and copyright disputes to the odd, human mistakes that shaped some of the most famous books ever printed. The book combined Rebecca's professional expertise in authentication and trade history with JP's skill for narrative storytelling, and it gave her, for the first time, a public voice that existed entirely outside of television. It's worth noting here that Romney's marriage to J.P. Romney also connected her, distantly, to a well-known American political family, JP has family ties to Mitt Romney, the former presidential candidate, and by extension to former Michigan Governor George Romney. It's a kind of detail that tends to generate outsized curiosity online, but Romney herself has consistently downplayed it, stating plainly in interviews that she has never actually met Mitt Romney. The connection, by her own account, is real but distant, a name on a family tree, not a relationship that shaped her career in any meaningful way. She and J.P. Romney later divorced, and she has kept details about her 2 children largely private. If Pawn Stars made Romney a familiar face, it's her more recent work that may end up being her most lasting contribution. In early 2025, she published Jane Austen's Bookshelf, a deeply researched book confronting what she has called literature's great forgetting, the systematic erasure of the women writers who directly shaped and inspired Jane Austen, many of whom were massive bestsellers in their own time and are now almost entirely out of print. Writers like Frances Burney and Radcliffe and Charlotte Smith weren't minor, obscure figures in the 18th century. They were commercially successful, widely read authors whose work sold in the thousands and influenced entire literary movements. Radcliffe, for instance, helped lay the groundwork for the Gothic tradition that would later shape Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley. And yet today, the overwhelming majority of 18th century novels written by women have simply vanished from print, while their male contemporaries remain firmly part of the literary canon. What makes Romney's approach to this subject so compelling is that she didn't come at it as an outside academic making an argument from a distance. She came at it as a book dealer, someone who had spent nearly 2 decades physically handling, buying, and selling historical texts, and who admitted candidly that she had personally overlooked most of these women writers for most of her career. She had read the canonical male authors of the period thoroughly. She had not read the women whose books Austen herself was reading and responding to. That personal realization became the engine behind the book. If someone as immersed in book history as she was could miss an entire category of influential writers, how many other readers, students, and even scholars had missed the same thing without ever noticing the gap? She spent years personally tracking down original editions of these forgotten authors' work, hunting through estate sales and auctions, competing with other collectors for rare surviving copies, building a personal collection that eventually grew to include dozens of these hard-to-find volumes. She used that collection as evidence, tracing exactly how many copies of these books were printed, how many survived, and how differently they were treated by critics and later publishers compared to the male authors writing at the same time. The book received strong critical attention on release, and quickly found a wide readership interested not just in Jane Austen herself, but in the wider, largely invisible literary world she came out of. One of the more surprising parts of Romney's career is which corner of the book world she has chosen to specialize in outside of the obvious blue-chip material. Alongside Shakespeare folios and Newton first editions, Romney has built a genuine, long-running expertise in genre fiction, romance novels, science fiction, and fantasy, categories that the traditional antiquarian trade spent decades treating as beneath serious attention. Old paperback romances with lurid covers, pulpy science fiction magazines, mass-market fantasy novels. None of it fit the conventional image of what belongs in a glass display case. Romney has argued consistently and publicly that this dismissal was never really about literary merit. It was about who was reading, writing, and buying these books. Romance novels in particular have historically been written by women, read overwhelmingly by women, and treated by much of the literary establishment as disposable entertainment rather than literature worth preserving. Romney set out to challenge that assumption directly, and in doing so became one of the very few rare book dealers in the country who treats vintage romance fiction as a legitimate, historically significant collecting category in its own right.